Well, thanks for coming out on this kind of brisk March afternoon. It's springtime in North Dakota, but springtime here is a lot like winter. So I'm glad you could make it. So yeah, the engineering department at the City Hall estimates that 20,000 people cross the Sorlie Bridge daily. And it's a safe bet that most of those people know very little, if anything, about the bridge's namesake. Also, due to some bad press over the last decade, many people that know something about Arthur Sorlie might have the wrong impression of him. That he might have been a divisive, polarizing figure, when actually we'll see that he was rather a compromiser, and I would say a bridge builder both literally and figuratively. And here are some of the bridges that he figuratively spanned. Now, Arthur's parents were born in Norway, so he grew up in a household that spoke Norwegian, and he was a lifelong member of the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America. Yet he himself was totally assimilated into American culture, native-born American. So I would say that he bridged the gap between the old country and America. Now, he was born and raised in Minnesota farm boy, but his business and political career was centered in North Dakota. So his life, just like his bridge, spanned the two states of Minnesota and North Dakota. Now, he made his mark originally as a businessman, a very successful entrepreneur, but he's best known as his role in government. So you could say that he spanned the fields of business and government. So, his detractors often referred to him as that conservative businessman, yet he was a strong supporter of the Nonpartisan League, state enterprises. He helped bring the mill and elevator to our city. So he spanned the divide between business and conservatism and progressivism. And lastly, he's the only individual resident, the only resident of Grand Forks to serve as governor of our state. So he bridged the gap between Grand Forks and Bismarck. So, as I say, Sorlie's father, Evers, he was born in Norway in 1835, actually, and emigrated to Wisconsin at the age of 17. He married, he worked for a while, saved up some money, and married a young girl, what was her name? Well, anyway, he did marry in 1859, and he and his bride moved to Minnesota. This was before the Homestead Act, so they paid cash for their quarter section in Freeborn County, Heartland Township, 11 miles north of Albert Lee, the county seat, and started farming there. Marin, I think his wife's name, Marin, oldest daughter. Marin, she was 18, he was 24 at the time. They started farming up there north of Albert Lee. They had their first kid and had a little girl in 1860. And in 1861, well, we all know what happened. A war broke out. So some of the information I'm going to relate to you is what I would call imagined history. Not imaginary, but I'm just going to fill in some of the blanks. And I'm thinking that Evers, here he was, a young guy. He had a wife, a small kid, working, trying to establish a homestead. And he gets a letter from his old Norski buddies back in Wisconsin saying, Ever, we're forming a regiment. We're going to it's going to be under the leadership of Colonel Hegg. You remember him. It'll be a great adventure. And so I'm sure, young man thinking, well, gee, that would be quite an adventure. So he signs up, he enlists. Now, I'm not a military historian, so I'm not sure how this worked, but he enlisted in Albert Lee in November of 1861. A three-year enlistment, but he didn't muster into the ranks till the following February, 200 miles away in Madison, Wisconsin. So I'm not sure how that worked, but anyway, he enlisted in the 15th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry, which is called the Norge Regiment, because most of the soldiers had come from Norway. And as I said, the commanding officer was Colonel Hans Christian Hegg, who was also born in Norway. So yeah, there's no picture of Evers in uniform, but I imagine he would look a lot like this guy. So he was 26, he was a young man, but he was no kid. He was probably outfitted with the Springfield rifle model 61, muzzle loader, shot mini balls. And mini balls were really a misnomer. They were not spherical, nor were they small. It's a good chunk of lead, cone-shaped with a hollow base. It was named after Claude Etienne, French military officer. But anyway, this was a big advancement. They were much more accurate than the old muskets. And this will tie into our story in a little while. So he joins the 15th Wisconsin, which is part of the Army of the Ohio. And after some training, they start heading south. And in October, they meet Braxton Bragg, the Confederate general in Perryville, Kentucky. Now, the 15th wasn't really engaged too much in that battle. Though it was an important battle, they didn't suffer any casualties. They just exchanged a few shots. It was a lot of people immediately after the battle thought it was a draw, but Braxton Bragg withdrew south, so it ended up to being an important victory for the Union. The Confederacy was hoping to bring Kentucky into the Confederacy, but due to this battle, that was not possible. So the 15th, along with the Army of the Ohio, continues south. And in December, they meet General Bragg again, this time in a really fierce battle, the Battle of Stones River. And this battle, as a percentage of casualties of the men involved, this was the bloodiest battle in the Civil War. It was really a fierce clash. And Evers was wounded. He took a mini ball in the thigh, broke his femur, the big bone there. He lay on the field bleeding, and he was very, very lucky not only to save his leg, but to save his life. You have to remember, of course, there was no transfusions, so if you lost blood, your body had to regenerate itself. There's no antibiotics rather, so if you got an infection, your own natural antibodies had to fight it off. Louis Pasteur at this time was working out his germ theory in Paris, but it didn't really inform the battlefield doctors in the Civil War. So he managed to survive. The prescription was bed rest. So he spent the next 4 months in military hospitals. And in May 1863, he was discharged as permanently disabled and given a $6 a month pension and sent home. Now, it's not clear how disabled he was, but what I imagine is that after his leg mended, it was somewhat shorter than his other leg. So he probably had a pronounced limp for the rest of his life. But I would say he fathered another 11 children after he returned from the war. So at least that part of his anatomy was still intact. Meanwhile, of course, the war went on without Evers. And the 15th continued their journey south. That October, they were involved in the Battle of Chickamauga in North Georgia. And that's where Colonel Haig met his fate. He was shot, he was gut shot by a Confederate sniper, another big mini ball in the gut. He lingered for a day and then died in October 1863. Now, in 1925, the state of Wisconsin erected this statue to Colonel Haig, and it stood there on the Capitol grounds for 95 years till June 2020, when a mob of Jacobins tore. Not only did they topple the statue, but they smashed it up beyond repair. There was another statue that was toppled that same night entitled Forward. It was a female figure in kind of classical robes with their right hand raised. And that was a bronze statue created in 1893, dedicated to the suffrage movement in Wisconsin. So on that one night, a statue to a man who was a abolitionist before the war and gave his life defending the Union and eradicating slavery, and a woman representing female suffrage movement both came down. So it's kind of ironic. Anyway, as I said, Evers, he went back to his farm in Freeborn County. I think he had enough excitement for one lifetime, and there's no evidence that he moved much from his farm. He and Murrin had 13 children. 9 lived to adulthood. I would like to point out the 2 Oscars. Oscar Cornelius, poor little guy, only lived a year, but then Oscar James came along, the next little boy came along, and they named him Oscar also. He lived to be 84. So you have to, it's always, a mistake to idolize people or persons, but you have to give these people credit. Yeah. I thought there was a question there. You have to give these people credit for their resiliency. They were determined to have a little Oscar, and doggone it, they got one. So, of course, in the beginning, no central heating or indoor plumbing, much less disposable diapers or baby formula. So, anyway, the Sorlies persevered. Now you can see that Arthur's kind of in the middle of the pack. Of course, raised on a farm, went to the country school till the 10th grade. And you can tell the Sorlies were doing okay because they could afford to send Arthur down to Albert Lea into the Luther Academy to finish up his education. It's a parochial school sponsored by the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America. And of course, it wasn't free, so it cost some money. Apparently, the academy didn't think much of the education that he had been getting, and they made him repeat the 10th grade. So he ended up having to spend 5 years to get out of high school. But I'm sure he got a good secondary education when he was done. Now, as soon as he graduated at the age of 19, he moved to Buxton, North Dakota. Now, why Buxton, I'm not sure, but presumably he had a family or friends that got him a job there. He got a job as a clerk in the First State Bank of Buxton, which he worked for 3 years there. Now, he had a early interest in politics, and in 1896 he worked for the McKinley campaign. McKinley was successful in his run for presidency, and to the victors go the spoils. So apparently one of the patronage jobs was postmaster, so Arthur became postmaster of Buxton, North Dakota. But back then, I guess it wasn't a full-time job because he also ran the general store. Might have been like a package deal or something, because often the post offices were in stores like our post office here on the grounds. So anyway, for 3 years he ran the post office, and in 1899, he became what they called a commercial traveler, what we would call a sales rep for the Kellogg and Johnson Shoe and Boot Company. And apparently he was very successful he was a good salesman because he was able to save up enough money to open a commercial bakery in Grand Forks. He was described as a hail fellow well met. So he was a bit of a glad hander. Yeah, the bakery was a success, and he sold it to his partners in 2007. Looking at Sorlie's business career, his modus operandi was diversify. He didn't concentrate on any one thing, and he often had partners, one or more partners. So that was his way of doing business. Yeah, he seemed to have the Midas touch at this point. He early saw the future in motor vehicles. He was in wholesale and retail fuel oil, gasoline, seed, feed, farm equipment, he had a car dealership, grain elevator, part ownership in a bank. So everything seemed to go well for him. So in 1900, he married Jenny Odegaard, who he had met in Buxton. And they had 3 children, Arthur O. Sorlie, Gladys Louise Sorlie, and Ruth Sorlie. And as a prosperous businessman, he was involved in local politics, and he served on the Grand Forks Um, well, today we call it the city council, but I think back then it was a commission. Leah, do you know what they called it? Yeah. But anyway, he was, and maybe they were called aldermen. I'm not sure. But anyway, he was involved in city government there for a while. He sold war bonds during World War I. And in 1919, he was part of a consortium of businessmen that agreed to purchase $1 million in bonds and provide a building site for the mill and elevator. So this is the mill and elevator in the 20s. So unfortunately, there was some tragedy in all this success. In 1918, Jenny suddenly took sick with the Spanish flu and died. She's only 38 years old, left behind 3 children. So Ruthie was only 13 months old. So in 1920, Arthur married Grace Hillaby. Grace was from Hillsborough, but Arthur might have met her in Grand Forks. She was an alumna of UND class of 1914. And after she graduated, I'm not sure what she did. I think, well, she moved back to Hillsborough, but the record is not clear as to what she was doing. But in 1917, she was back in Grand Forks teaching school. She taught school here for a couple of years and then taught down in Minneapolis. And in 1920, when she married Arthur, her hometown was given as Minneapolis. And Arthur and Grace had 3 children. Alton, who went by his middle name Glenn, and Charlotte, a little girl who died in infancy, and Evelyn. Now, I call this the missing child picture because where is Gladys? Where is Gladys Louise Sorlie? She should be standing there between her big brother and her little sister, but I don't think she was airbrushed out. So where she didn't make the trip to Bismarck. Here's my theory. Well, first of all, we know a couple things about Gladys. First of all, she hated her first name, and she always went by Louise, so we'll call her Louise. Louise was 10 when her mother died, and 12 when Arthur remarried. And here was this strange woman, the evil stepmother, coming into the house. And I think they probably didn't get along too well. Now, the Sorleys were a big crew, and she had plenty of aunts and uncles, and Jenny probably had relatives too. So I believe that she probably went to live with relatives because she just didn't get along. Ruthie, on the other hand, as I said, she was 13 months old when her mother died. She bonded very well with Grace. In fact, you can see she's kind of leaning towards Grace in this picture. Of course, Ruth never really knew her mother. Ruth, She went on to graduate from Central High and UND class of 39. She soon after graduation, she married a guy named was it Edick? Edick? Do you know Mike? I should give a shout out to my collaborator here, Mike Swanson. Mike is the archivist at the Chester Fritz, and some of these images we're seeing here are only available at the special collections, and we're very fortunate to have the Sorlie papers in the special collections. The Sorlie papers are actually two big scrapbooks compiled by Grace, I believe, and donated by her three younger children back in the 1980s to the library. So she married soon after graduating UND, and they moved to Edick. Was the guy's name Edick? Yeah, I thought you said you saw some papers from him when I mentioned. I'm not sure I have it written down who she married. Anyway, unfortunately, the marriage was not a success. They got divorced. There was no children, and Ruth moved to Washington, D.C., where she worked on the Hill for several years before getting a job at the Small Business Administration. She made it a career out of that. When she retired, she moved to Arizona, but when she died, she had her body shipped back here to Grand Forks, and she's buried in the Memorial Park near her father. So she definitely had roots, a pull to Grand Forks. Both the boys served in World War II. As far as the missing Louise, she died of liver disease at the age of 48 in LA in 1956. So it's possible maybe she took to drink. I don't know. She seemed to be alienated from the family. It's kind of a tragic figure. The littlest one, Evelyn, when they donated the papers to the library, she gave her hometown as Falls Church, Virginia, I believe, which is suburban Washington. So she moved to the Washington area also. Ruth, incidentally, created a scholarship in her mother's name at UND. I don't know if it's still existing. So in 1922, another Norski, Ragnvald Nestos, was elected governor. And Nestos is kind of an interesting fellow also. He was born in 1877. And he moved he moved to Buxton also. So Sorlie and Nestos must have met in Buxton during the 1890s. Anyway, Nestos, he didn't have literally a dime in his pocket. His uncle financed his trip over to America. And he was going to work off the debt in his uncle's harness shop and farm. And Nestos, he did have some real virtues. He was extremely hardworking, really workaholic, which they teetotaler, lifelong bachelor, smart, very honest, but not a natural politician. He was kind of high-strung and a bit prickly. So that's his official portrait. And here he's at Camp Grafton, which is the camp for the North Dakota National Guard, campaigning in 1924. So during this period, the Republican Party was extremely dominant in North Dakota, but it was broken into two very different factions, which often when a party has a supermajority, it does divide. And one was the Nonpartisan League, which was kind of the progressive wing of the party. Think of Teddy Roosevelt and the Bull Moose. The other was the Independent Voters Association. Think more Calvin Coolidge, it's small government, what we might call libertarian. And Nestos was in the independence side of the party. Now, as I say, he came to this country speaking only a few words of English, but he was intelligent, hardworking. He learned enough English to go to the Mayville Normal School, and he got a teaching certificate, taught school for a couple of years, then went to Madison and got a bachelor's at the University of Wisconsin, then came to Grand Forks and got a law degree. All the time working through school and finishing his studies in record time, yeah, he was smart, but not that politic. So Nestos is governor. He's a Republican. In January 1924, there are very, very few people that would predict that Arthur Sorlie would be governor-elect by the end of the year. But that happened, and a couple things happened. One thing, Nestos alienated a lot of people. He was very parsimonious, and he vetoed a couple popular bills that really set people off. He vetoed a bridge across the Missouri that a lot of people wanted, and he also vetoed funds for the North Dakota School of Forestry up in Bottineau. And in fact, the school had to close its doors for 2 years for lack of funds. So Arthur refunded the school, and it's still it's in existence today as Dakota College. Sorlie, he hadn't held elective office in 10 years, and then it was just a city council seat. But he always had his foot in the door of Republican politics. And in the convention in March of the League, it was kind of deadlocked. The League itself was divided into the moderates and the left wing. And so Arthur was a compromise candidate. He was, and he had several things going for him as a compromise candidate. One, he was a businessman, yet he supported the state enterprises, the mill, the bank, and who was open to having other state enterprises as well. Two, he was affluent businessman, and the hope was that he would self-finance his campaign. And three, he was from the very eastern part of the state, and the League was stronger in the West. So with those three things going, he got the League's nomination, and he would meet Sorlie in the Republican primary in June. However, he almost didn't live to see the primary. In May, driving back to Grand Forks over very rutted rural roads, he and two companions flipped their car. There was a mud puddle which turned into be a really deep rut, and the car rolled. And in those days, of course, no seat belts, no padded dash, just three men tumbling around in a steel container. What happened? State Senator Burt Baker was killed. Roy Frazee, chairman of the GOP, was seriously injured, as well as Arthur. Arthur broke his collarbone and had a severe concussion, but he recovered enough to campaign, and he was a good campaigner. Elwyn Robinson describes Sorlie. He was a large, friendly person of democratic manner. So he was just like he was a good salesman. He was a good campaigner. Now, unfortunately, there was a big hiccup in his race for governor, and he was accused of being a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, why? Who made these accusations, and why were they made? Well, they were made by Jerry Bacon, who was the publisher of the Grand Forks Herald at the time. And Bacon hated the League. He was a Nestos man, and I'm sure that motivated him to make these accusations. So what evidence did Bacon have to make these charges? Well, first of all, historians, when they look for evidence, they look for some documentation, something written, or a firsthand account of an event. And there's no of that type of evidence that Sorlie was involved with the Klan. There is some circumstantial evidence. The previous year in 1923, there was a large Klan rally in Larimore, and Sorlie and two of his business associates attended. Now, they weren't in Klan regalia. They were, three businessmen, 1920s, fedoras, three-piece business suits. They're kind of off to the side observers. They all had business interest in Larimore, so of course they were interested in what was going on there. But that was one piece. The other more damning piece was that Halsey Ambrose, who was the pastor at the First Presbyterian Church and leader of the Grand Forks Klan, endorsed Sorlie for governor. Now, why would Reverend Ambrose endorse Sorlie for governor? It does seem kind of strange because in the past, Reverend Ambrose had been an opponent of the League. But there are three elements of politics: policy, power, and personality. And as I say, personality worked against Nestos, and the backstory was that in the previous year, Nestos had signed an anti-masking bill, which really ticked off Reverend Ambrose. In fact, Ambrose had traveled to Bismarck to testify against this bill. And he said that if Nestos signs this bill, I'm going to punish him politically. So Nestos signs the bill. Reverend Ambrose is out to get him. So that's basically why he endorsed Sorlie. Sorlie was not a member of his church. He was not a member of the Klan. Ambrose issued a written statement to the fact that Sorlie was not a member of the Klan. Sorlie made a verbal statement saying that he was not a member of the Klan. And basically, the controversy died for 89 years till Patrick Springer of the Fargo Forum ran this piece in March 2013 about Sorlie's possible connection with the Klan. Then Curtis Eriksmoen picked it up a year later and ran with it. Now, Eriksmoen, he certainly, he's had 9 volumes of fantastic or fascinating North Dakotans, 9 volumes of, so he's done a lot of historiography in North Dakota for sure. But Eriksmoen is kind of a sensationalist type of historian, more like Ripley's Believe It or Not or Man Bites Dog type approach. Not only did Eriksmoen have this this article in the paper, but he devoted a chapter to this subject in his volume 9 of Fascinating North Dakotans. So anyway, here's the Republican primary in June. Now, we can see Sorlie won. Now, that looks a little suspicious, doesn't exactly 73,000 votes, but my fact checker here, Mike, assures me that that was the official count of his votes. The interesting thing is this fellow Mo. Mo, he was a spoiler, and he ran specifically, here, I'm going to quote Crawford, who wrote, the last slide will be sources, so I forget Crawford's first name, but he did a history of North Dakota, and to quote him, I.J. Mo ran on an anti-league platform to split that vote. In other words, to split Nestos' vote due to personal grievances. It is said that Mo desired the defeat of Nestos. So here, so poor Nestos couldn't catch a break. A dark horse unknown challenges him, who almost gets killed in an automobile accident and is the beneficiary of somebody who split his vote out of personal grievances. And Sorlie won the Republican primary, and of course he was a shoo-in for the November election. Now, one interesting thing about the presidential election in 1924 is the run of Bob LaFollette of Wisconsin, running as the progressive third party. Bob LaFollette carried one state, Wisconsin, but the state that he had the highest, second highest percentage of votes was in North Dakota. And you can see Davis, the Democrat, is a distant third. He's really not a factor at all. Now, to highlight the kind of the sniping that the left wing of the league was engaged in on Sorlie, Sorlie actually supported LaFollette's third-party candidate, but the left wing of the league groused that he hadn't supported him soon enough. But Sorlie was politic enough to know that he wanted to get the primary away before he went out on a limb and supported a third-party candidate. So Sorlie wins the election, and here's the governor's. Well, here it's called a mansion. I would say it's more like just a residence. This is the Asa Fisher House on 4th Street and Avenue B, built in 1884. It was bought by the state in 1893 as the governor's residence. I believe that the house is still standing there And you say, yeah, it's still standing right there. I don't know if it looks, this is the way it looked in the mid-20s when the Sorlies lived there. The shots of the interior, it's kind of a, a gloomy Victorian place. It needed an update already by the mid-20s. This is the State House in the mid-20s. Now this is the building that burned down in December 1930 and was replaced by our skyscraper that we have now. But that's the way it looked when Sorlie was governor. Not really that attractive. You know, some people would say, well, North Dakota, I mean, a rural state, low population, not affluent. But this past summer, I was in Cheyenne, and this same period of time, Wyoming built a beautiful state capital that's still existing today. So, but whatever. So in January 1925, Sorlie takes office, and he gives his State of the State speech. And you know, some of the issues that resonate today are really outdated. Reminds me of Williams Jennings Bryan Cross of Gold speech that electrified his nominating convention. Of course, the gold standard is really not much of an issue. A lot of this his speech doesn't really relate to topics of today. One of the interesting things was that selling snuff and cigarettes was against the law in North Dakota in 1925. And Sorlie points out that during the war, the YMCA, Salvation Army, and Knights of Columbus distributed tobacco products to our boys, but it's illegal to sell them in North Dakota. So he suggested that we do away with that law. He engaged in some 1920s boosterism. And to get a little flavor of the speech, I'll quote him. He kind of sums up. He says, "Our citizens are, upon the whole, more literate and of higher intelligence than those of our neighboring states. The beauty and social charms of our ladies is growing from year to year. Our young men have the pep, the vigor, the stamina, and the bulldog stick-to-itiveness which comes to them from the very air they breathe." So it's a little Babbitry, but you know, governors even today, they use superlatives to describe their state. So it's not too far off. So how is he going to promote the state? Well, one of the ways was to establish a Teddy Roosevelt National Park. Now, Roosevelt has always been popular in North Dakota, and as soon as Roosevelt died in 1919, and there was calls for a park in his name in the Badlands where he had ranched in the 1880s. But it was a hard sell. Congress, to establish a national park, you need congressional action. And many in Congress didn't think the area was really worthy of a national park. In 1921, the North Dakota State Legislature instructed our congressional delegation, which at that time I think had 4. We had 2 representatives. Anyway, they instructed them to get legislation to create this park. And this 1925 expedition was an effort to promote this park. And these pictures kind of intrigue me because it looks kind of like the Wild West. there were no paved roads. There was no bridge across the Little Missouri. They had to ford the bridge. So this promotional expedition, 1925, called the Congressmen and Cowboys. They called this the Grand Canyon of the Little Missouri, trekking in the tracks of Teddy. And so you either had to be on horseback or horse-drawn wagon. And they did ford the Little Missouri at one point, and they did some tent camping. And I don't know how many elected officials would be up for that nowadays. The cars back then I mean, they didn't have the kind of 4x4s that we have. In fact, many of those early cars didn't even have fuel pumps. So if you had to go up a steep incline, the fuel was gravity fed. And if it was an extended fuel ascent, you could actually run out of gas. So this kind of terrain, it was only horses. So they promoted this. It was the bill was still stalled in Congress. Sorlie went on another promotional tour in 1928. The park was finally built due to circumstances. So in the late 20s and 30s, many of the people that tried ranching and farming in the area failed. The land reverted back to the public domain. Then in 33, the CC boys came in. They were the ones that built the first paved roads, bridges, campsites, picnic shelters. In 1942, the CCC closed their doors because of the war, and the federal government wanted to hand the land back to the state of North Dakota, who refused to accept it because, well, if it's yours, you have to maintain it, and a state park would be much less prestigious than a national park. So finally, after the war in 47, there was a memorial park, National Memorial Park, created. And then in 74, the regular national park that we have today. So back in the day, of course, the governor only had a 2-year term. So Sorlie had to ran in 1926, and he won in a landslide. He was quite popular. More as much to do with his personality as his accomplishments. He wasn't able to get the mill running at a profit, and that was his big issue. He was the experienced businessman that was going to get the mill turning a profit. He wasn't able to do that. Of course, his predecessor wasn't able to do that, and his successor wasn't able to do that either. So it just, for some reason, it just took a while for the mill to get going well. And of course, today it's running really fabulously. So he was an infrastructure, but in infrastructure, he was quite accomplished. And as I said, he was an auto enthusiast. This is with his pride and joy, his Oldsmobile. Oldsmobiles were his make. And you can see he's the one that's holding the pennant there on the left with his new Oldsmobile that he was quite proud of. So he, during his tenure, 2 new bridges across the Missouri at Williston and Standish. Thousands of miles were added to the state highway system. And in 1928, Sorlie signed a bill to build a new bridge across the Red at Grand Forks. So as I mentioned, TR, very popular in this region. In 1919, the Teddy Roosevelt International Auto Trail was established. And basically, it was the Northern Tier route that you see outlined here. And in 1921, the Federal Highway Act was passed. It's interesting, the federal government, even though there was a conservative Republican administrations, the federal government was very early involved in highway construction. So in 1926, Route 2 was officially designated. Now, originally, Route 2 was going to be an international highway. It was going to go through Canada, but somehow that never worked out. So today it's broken up into two parts, one in northern New England and then the Straits of Mackinac all the way to Puget Sound. And as we know, it runs through Grand Forks. It was parallel to the Northern Railroad, Great Northern Railroad route, the Highlander. Now, one problem was this bridge across the Red. This is the old Demers Bridge, sometimes called the Old Steel Bridge. It was built in 1889 before the advent of motorized traffic. And it was described as rickety by a couple of historians. It was also quite narrow, totally inadequate for heavy motor vehicles. So Sorlie pushed through this legislation for a new bridge. It was a bargain, $300,000, of which half was going to be paid by the federal government, quarter by the North Dakota, 75,000 North Dakota, 75,000 Minnesota. So it was quite the deal. So also in 1928, Sorlie announced that he was not going to run for re-election. And I think it's because he knew he had health issues. In 1900, the two leading causes of mortality in the United States was pneumonia and tuberculosis. By 1920, the leading cause was heart disease, and it's been that way ever since. And Arthur knew he had heart disease. He had angina, and it was by the 20s, diagnosing heart disease, they were pretty good at diagnosing it, but the treatment was still in its infancy, and a lot of people thought it was stress. It was a middle-aged, middle-class male disease brought on by the stress of their jobs. Of course, now stress is still considered a factor, but of course, diet, exercise, genetics also play a role. But anyway, the prescription was to decompress, de-stress your life, take it easy. So I'm sure Arthur thought, well, he was going to go back to Grand Forks and mind the store. He still had young children to raise, and he was going to dial it back a little bit. Yet he remained very active. He wasn't semi-retired in the governorship at all. He proposed a new state elevator in Fargo. He also suggested a Missouri diversion in 1928. So this is something that's been talked about for a long, long time. He conducted a second promotional tour in the Badlands in July of 28, and he dedicated a new bridge across the Little Missouri, Challin's Ferry, 16 miles south of Watford City. But all this activity was too much for Arthur, and he had a heart attack in August 25th, 1928. Now, he took to his bed in the governor's residence, and he seemed to improve. His condition he seemed to get better. But on August 28th, he had another heart attack, and his heart just gave out, and he died. So here he's lying at state in the state house of the Capitol. So a special train took him back to Grand Forks for his funeral. And a huge crowd greeted the train there. The funeral was held at the city auditorium, and he was buried in Memorial Park. So you can visit his grave and that of his family there in Memorial Park. So after his death, Grace and the three younger children moved back to Grand Forks to their house at 201 Chestnut Street. The bridge that bears his name opened on September 14th, 1929. Grace drove the first car across the bridge. There's Ruth and Alton, Glenn, Sorlie, and little Evelyn. So at this point, Ruth's an orphan. Both her mother and father are dead. You see, they all have, the three gals have the bucket hat that was popular in the 20s. And Glenn's got his knickers on. So you can see also in the background, you see First and Second Streets that no longer exist. But that plaque and the bridge actually look quite identical to it is today. So summing up Sorlie's tenure, 3.5 years, he was not able to run the mill at a profit, but he did build basically the modern infrastructure of roads and bridges that we have today. And he was a big promoter of the state. So the Sorlie Bridge has really stood the test of time. In 2012, there were some minor renovations. There was some rust that had to be removed. It got a paint job, new lighting, but structurally, it was quite sound after all these years. You know, we've had catastrophic bridge failures in Minneapolis and Pittsburgh, which had fatalities, but the Sorlie Bridge has stood strong. I mean, some years the ice flows, these huge ice chunks go crashing into the pillar there, and even the decking, and big trees are uprooted. They're like 50-foot battering rams, big cottonwoods floating down. All the beat trucks and construction equipment, and so it's really stood up. Now here's Mike came across this innovation. You probably, if you've walked under the Greenway path there, you've seen these wheels, and this was an innovation of the UND engineering department, and you're probably familiar with the fate of Old Main, the original building on campus, designed by one of the leading architectural firms in the Twin Cities, who had zero experience with the Red River soils, and the foundation was totally inadequate. It started listing, and finally it had to be torn down. Well, all bridges have expansion joints on the deck as the surface heats and cools. This bridge has expansion joints in the foundations along the banks. So our Red River mud can expand and contract. And so these wheels actually will move the bridge back and forth to accommodate the shifting embankment there. So getting back, yeah, there's a recent picture of the Sorlie Bridge standing proud. Now, Eric Smoen, in his 2018 book, he wrote in this chapter on Sorlie, he wrote that Sorlie was a Klan member has never been proven, but the stigma of this impression forever tarnishes the legacy of Arthur G. Sorlie. I say nuts. I don't think that a campaign smear that was never proven should be the dominating legacy of Arthur Sorlie. So that's my presentation. Thank you.